Because of the pandemic, use of the MBTA has fallen to about 1/4 of its normal ridership. There's an imperative to serve those riders, many of them essential workers, but there's also a need to reckon with a loss of revenue along with some new expenses. To make that all work, the T has come out with a plan for cutbacks in service, with the most significant on routes with the fewest current riders. To tell us about the plan is the T's Chief of Operations Strategy, Policy, and Oversight, Benesh. Thank you very much for being with us, Kat.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Kat, before we get into some of these itemized cutbacks, put this into perspective, because even if all of these were to go into effect, wouldn't the T still be coming up short?
No, it's a fair question, Chris, and let me set some broad context. So the MBTA right now, based on the reduced ridership that we're seeing, as you spoke about, we're about 25% of our pre-COVID ridership, and that's across the entire system. We're looking at a budget deficit next year, somewhere between $300 to $600 million. And $600 million represents about 1/4 of our overall operating budget, so it is a significant shortfall. And this is, let me also say, the MBTA cutting service or reducing service is always the decision of last resort. It's something the MBTA never wants to do. So before we even started thinking about how we might reduce service, we're undertaking a number of internal measures, trying to reduce our internal spend, as well as taking a hard look at our entire capital program, and trying to determine which projects we could potentially delay or slow down in order to be able to flex some of our capital spending to the operating side in the short term, so that the service reductions really are a discussion of last resort.
What about the timing here? Because a lot of the people who oppose the cuts are saying, maybe there are other options as far as getting revenue, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. Why not wait a little longer?
So two things on that. One is the reason we're having this conversation now is so the MBTA, we can be thoughtful, strategic, and have a conversation with our public and the board and our riders to say, no one wants to do this, but if we have to do it, if it becomes a probable outcome, let's take the time to discuss it so we can do it right and plan and implement. As we always say, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And I think also that depending on the timing of any additional funding, depending on the timing of a vaccine, and depending on the timing of economic recovery, I think we're potentially looking at a multi-year challenge here. Even if we have complete immunity and a working vaccine by, say, next summer, I think there's still a question about how has transportation and travel patterns fundamentally changed in the region? What if teleworking is still here to stay? What if people now decide to go to their local corner grocery store or the big box store and they weren't before? So travel patterns have likely fundamentally shifted. And so not only is it responding to the budget crisis, but also thinking about what is the future of our travel patterns across the entire region that we wanted to start talking about.
Well, one of the lines being cut back is the E line between Brigham Circle and Hayes Street. And I know that line pretty well, and I know the ridership thins out after Brigham Circle if you're going outbound. But at the same time, a lot of new housing has been built up around Hayes Street. You've got expansion of the VA Medical Center. It seems to me that there's a whole transit-oriented policy that has evolved here, and now it's suddenly being unplugged. I mean, isn't that something you have to be careful of?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it's something where one of the reasons we're hosting 11 public meetings. I think we've done 4. We have, 7 more between now and December 7th to hear this feedback, because we looked at a lot of data, we're looking at a lot of analysis, we're looking at our ridership patterns, we've been talking to businesses and communities, but we know what we're proposing is not perfect. So we really do want that feedback and to think how we might be able to change. That being said, on that particular proposal, and I know we have gotten a lot of feedback, which we appreciate, is it's about 0.8 miles that we're asking to instead divert to the Route 39, which is one of our key bus routes. We would be increasing service on that bus route. So there would still be what I would consider a very high level of service, though it would require individuals to transfer between potentially a bus and rapid transit where they were before, which I think is different than some of our other proposals are reducing frequency outright, or potentially eliminating service after midnight on the bus or rapid transit, or even potentially eliminating some bus routes altogether. So it's trying to think through all those trade-offs about how do we preserve access for those who are most dependent on transit, and preserving the service we are preserving is still a high quality, frequent service, so it's a viable form of transportation for those who need it most.
I know you're cutting back a lot of other areas, rapid transit service after midnight, but the frequency of service across the board would be down. I have not been on these lines at peak hours lately, but I've been on them at some other times, and I do wonder about the crowding, even though people have masks on. Is it going to be safe if you're going to be running those trains less often?
So we do look at ridership very closely, and so I think two responses there is one, we don't think, so overall in the system on rapid transit, we're at about 25% of pre-COVID ridership across all of our rapid transit. As you can imagine, during peak, it's significantly down. We really don't see those 9 to 5 commuters much at all, but it's much more level throughout the day. And yet we're still actually running close to peak service, which is something we're looking at. Does our service pattern still make sense? We do keep a close eye on, we have essentially a maximum number we want on any vehicle at a time. We won't bypass anyone if we pass that, but from a planning perspective, we want to make sure that we're trying to put service where we see that demand accordingly, and trying to reduce that crowding, though we know it does still happen. As we think forward into the summer, when we looked at these cuts and we looked at these reductions, we're trying to take ridership into account as best as possible, and believe that we won't be exacerbating ridership or crowding, because ridership, there's been tremendous variation route by route. So some of our bus routes have more than 60% of their pre-COVID ridership, and yet some of our bus routes are under 20%. So when we think about where we put buses, where we put trains, trying to keep that into account, because it will require essentially a different solution or a different plan for every route.
By the way, talk about that end of the spectrum, because you do have some buses that are heavily used, and you've even got some early bird service where a lot of people need that as well. What are you going to be doing about those?
Great question. So, and throughout, we have seen, when we looked at our ridership, it has been incredibly durable in the AM mornings, those 4 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m., some of that's, I think, probably our most durable ridership. And on some routes, particularly the routes that cross over into East Boston, Chelsea, and Everett, some of our most durable ridership. Those are the routes that will probably see the least amount of change. We are not proposing to change the start of service at all. We're only proposing to end service earlier. So ending service at midnight rather than, say, 1 or 2 a.m. for bus or rapid transit. And on those bus routes that have really retained a lot of their ridership, they will probably see very little, if any, frequency reduction. So again, like the routes 111, the 116, the 117, where we've seen over 50–60% of that ridership really be retained through the pandemic. It's routes like the SL2, which serves the seaport, where we've seen 20% of our ridership that we think we can still provide good service, but it doesn't need to come quite as frequently, because we don't have as many business travelers, say, going to Logan or into the seaport.
I know that the changes are mainly about the operations spending, but the T has been for the past several years catching up on decades worth of disinvestment. What's that going to look like going ahead? Because the pandemic must have some effect on that.
Yes, so we are reviewing our entire capital program. We are still intending to we put together a framework to say what capital projects do we continue, and any capital project that's currently under construction, we are continuing. Where we're essentially delaying capital projects are those that have not moved on to the construction phase or have not yet started design, and we're not canceling anything either. We're basically saying we're gonna take a pause and then go through our typical annual capital planning process to allow for sort of the full strategic and public input to say what is still a priority. And I think when we think about what's most important, I think things related to safety, maintenance of the system, accessibility are probably some of our most important areas to continue to invest in, to ensure that the system, to building on that, because the MBTA, you're right, we have spent over $1 billion a year of trying to improve the state of good repair of the system, and intend to keep doing so.
As you alluded to earlier, we could be in for some permanent changes stemming from the pandemic, even if the temporary ones go away pretty soon. There are people out there who are worried. They say some of these cuts, they might be with us forever. How do you persuade them that there's a right way to readjust?
It's a hard question. And I think the the key areas where I think we see that is so the E-line, the proposal of the temporary suspension of the ferries, some eliminations in bus routes, and some station closures on the commuter rail are probably the most keenly felt by individuals. I think the MBTA at the same time is still very committed to our longer term strategic plans. So as viewers may know, between Rail Vision, so a multi-year strategic plan thinking about what is the future of our commuter rail and regional rail, how do we better serve our broader network, and at the same time, bus network redesign, knowing that our bus system, honestly, it was still set up for not realizing the existence of Kendall Square or Longwood or Seaport and thinking about what connections we need to make. And we're still strongly invested in those projects and know that when we rebuild, we intend to rebuild and we tend to leverage that strategic work to say, knowing that we had gaps before COVID in our system, how do we actually build back a system that is even better than it was with better connections, better service patterns, and more accurately represents the needs of the region.
Well, I know one of the things that the T and the city of Boston have been working on lately are these dedicated lanes for buses so they can move more quickly. Will some of that still be going ahead?
Yes, so bus lines, absolutely. And we're thrilled that I think we have built, along with the Shared Streets program of MassDOT in partnership with municipalities, I think over 10 miles of bus lanes just this calendar year. And as bus has been our most durable mode of ridership throughout the pandemic, with over 40% of our riders still choosing to ride the system, it's absolutely essential that we continue to think about how to move people effectively and efficiently through the area, and have a whole slate of bus lanes we're hoping to build in the next calendar year as well, in partnership with our municipalities.
Finally, Kat, if people want to find out more about some of the community engagement events around this plan or any ways that plan might evolve, is there a way they can track that online?
Yes, so if they want to go to mbta.com/forging ahead, all one word, it would direct them to our page where there's both a list of the upcoming online public events where people can listen to learn more about the plan, as well as submit testimony or ask clarifying questions. And there's also tons of material on there so people can find specifically the impacts to their community or their route, as well as an online form. And we will be reading and reviewing every single comment that comes in through any of those forms. And again, very much appreciate any time that anyone takes to submit some feedback and thoughts.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to ride us through that.
My pleasure, Chris. Thank you.
Kat Benesh from the MBTA will have more news in just a moment.